Still mad about how Game of Thrones went down? Fear not. House of the Dragon has got your back. Keep watching to find out why you should give it a shot. Game of Thrones took a heavy hit following the release of its 8th season. The show's final episodes were panned by fans, many of whom criticized the story's rushed pacing and many attempts to subvert audiences' expectations. So, what went wrong? Well, for one thing, the White Walkers were defeated in one episode after 8 seasons of build-up. And if you thought the Night King's stare-down with Jon Snow in Season 5's Hardhome guaranteed an epic final fight between the two, well, think again. Arya Stark is the one to take out the Night King in the show, while Jon is preoccupied with the undead dragon Viserion. But that's not all. The revelation that Jon is actually Aegon Targaryen, trueborn son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, ultimately leads to nothing. Jon never ascends the Iron Throne or fulfills the prophecy of the prince that was promised. Meanwhile, Daenerys Targaryen flips from Misa to Mad Queen in one harrowing episode, which sees her slaughter the civilians of King's Landing with dragonfire. Oh, and Jaime Lannister abandons Brienne of Tarth to die with his sister and lover Cersei. In the end, Bran Stark emerges from the ashes as the new king of Westeros because reasons.
And who has a better story than Bran the Broken?
Naturally, all of this led many Game of Thrones fans to vow that they were finished with the once-esteemed fantasy franchise. So far, only one aspect of the Game of Thrones finale has been confirmed to come from Martin himself, King Bran. During a 2019 interview published by HBO, actor Isaac Hempstead Wright stated, "David Benioff and Dan Weiss told me there were 2 things George R.R. Martin had planned for Bran, and that was the Hodor revelation and that he would be king. So that's pretty special to be directly involved in something that is part of George's vision. Unless Martin changes his mind, fans can expect to see Bran on the throne in the books as well as in the show. Everything else, however, that remains questionable. Martin has even said that fans know an ending but not the ending. It's certainly easy for fans to remain hopeful for a more satisfying conclusion to the novels. Fortunately, House of the Dragon seems to be rebuilding bridges with its spurned audience. A prequel to Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon takes place 172 years before Daenerys Targaryen's birth and documents one of the most turbulent times in her family's history, the period of civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons. For fans who loved the political drama and scandals of Game of Thrones, this is the perfect successor show to scratch that itch. During its premiere episode, House of the Dragon places as much emphasis on the Song of Ice and Fire as it does Game of Thrones. In Heirs of the Dragon, King Viserys informs his daughter Rhaenyra about a prophetic dream of their ancestor, Aegon's, that spurred him to conquer Westeros with his dragon, Balerion, the Black Dread.
Aegon called his dream the Song of Ice and Fire.
King Viserys passes on Aegon's vision of a terrible winter gusting out of the distant north, which prompted the Conqueror to create the Iron Throne and unify the kingdoms under Targaryen rule. It's an interesting tidbit that further fleshes out the story of the others. But why did the showrunners Ryan Condal and Miguel Sapochnik choose to include a prophecy about the White Walkers in a show about House Targaryen, particularly in its first episode? As it turns out, Aegon the Conqueror's prophecy comes from none other than George R.R. Martin. The author confirmed his involvement with House of the Dragon early on, while showrunner Ryan Condal spoke to Esquire about collaborating with Martin. He said, "George hired me, and I came to this as a fan. He was very involved with the beginning of the show. Obviously, it does not exist without him. He wrote the original source material." Condal continued, "This was the successor show that I think he was most interested in, of all the ones that HBO was considering and exploring. Certainly in the very beginning, in the conceptual phase, George was very involved." In an interview with the New York Times, Martin compared his involvement with House of the Dragon to Game of Thrones, remarking how he was kept out of the loop during the later seasons of Thrones. He claimed, "By season 5 and 6, and certainly 7 and 8, I was pretty much out of the loop. I don't know why. You have to ask showrunners Dan and Dave." With Martin at the helm, House of the Dragon offers the chance to tell a story more faithful to the author's original vision. Thanks to George R.R. Martin's involvement, House of the Dragon seems to be bridging the gap between show and book canon. For example, Aegon's prophecy makes no mention of anything to symbolize Arya Stark as the savior of humanity.
Sticking with the pointy end.
The last scions of House Targaryen don't really faze the Night King in Game of Thrones, as Daenerys and Drogon quickly discover the icy villain is fireproof, while Jon is overwhelmed by undead soldiers before he can take a swing at any White Walkers. It's certainly possible that Aegon's prophecy in House of the Dragon isn't supposed to foreshadow the Game of Thrones finale. In 2019, before Season 8 aired, Martin revealed to Entertainment Weekly that he hadn't read any scripts for the final season, stating, "There's a lot of minor character arcs they'll be coming up with on their own. And of course, they passed me several years ago. There may be important discrepancies." More recently, Martin confirmed on his blog that his ending will be different, adding, "Not all of the characters who survived until the end of Game of Thrones will survive until the end of A Song of Ice and Fire, and not all of the characters who died on Game of Thrones will die in A Song of Ice and Fire." Before House of the Dragon, HBO almost greenlit another prequel to follow Season 8 of Game of Thrones. The planned series, titled Bloodmoon, was to take place 8,000 years before the events of the original show, during an era known as the Age of Heroes. What was Bloodmoon about? In summary, the White Walkers. This prequel would have depicted the first long night, 8 centuries before the Night King's defeat at Winterfell, with the White Walkers descending on humanity from the far north for the very first time. According to HBO, Bloodmoon was going to be seriously epic in scope. The first press release stated, "From the horrifying secrets of Westeros' history to the true origin of the White Walkers, the mysteries of the East to the Starks of legend, it's not the story we think we know." Jane Goldman was to serve as showrunner alongside George R. R. Martin as an executive producer, while Naomi Watts had been cast in the lead role. Sadly, Bloodmoon never made it past production. A pilot episode was filmed, but the series was shelved in favor of House of the Dragon. Given that Bloodmoon was supposed to focus on the Long Night and the origin of the White Walkers, it's possible that Aegon's prophecy, or whatever inspired it, would have been heavily involved in that series. It's worth noting that HBO doesn't necessarily need Bloodmoon to redeem the series finale. Along with a slate of prequel shows, George R. R. Martin confirmed on his blog that a sequel to Game of Thrones is currently in the pipeworks. Not much is known so far about the sequel, but what fans do know is that the planned series is Jon Snow-centric, with actor Kit Harington leading the project.
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
Official news of the Jon Snow sequel first broke in a piece for The Hollywood Reporter. Amelia Clark later verified in an interview with the BBC that Harington essentially created the show and that he is in it from the ground up. There are no guarantees that the Jon Snow sequel will make it out of pre-production. Still, if the series does make it to the small screen, it could retcon parts of Season 8. It might even correspond with Aegon's prophecy in House of the Dragon. A sequel starring Jon Snow, aka Aegon Targaryen, could very well feature the return of the White Walkers, led by a new icy villain for him to face. Game of Thrones could also be brought back to the small screen in animation. According to George R. R. Martin's blog, an animated prequel set in the distant land of Essos is also in the early stages of pre-production. The Golden Empire of Yidi, inspired by Imperial China, predates both Old Valyria and The Long Night. Some fans speculate that it was the Gemstone Emperors of Yidi who taught the Valyrians how to control dragons. Corlys Velaryon made the long, perilous voyage to Yidi in his youth, something that viewers could witness if his prequel series is greenlit. If HBO branches into animation with its Yidi series, then it's also possible fans could see an animated adaptation of A Song of Ice and Fire in the future. Animation requires a less hefty budget too, something that might appeal to HBO after it spent $90 million on the final season of Game of Thrones. This is one way that Thrones could return bigger and bloodier than ever. The inclusion of Aegon's prophecy to House of the Dragon doesn't appear to be a fluke. A Weeks Ahead trailer released on the official Game of Thrones YouTube channel has teased even more prophecies in the show. In the teaser, Millie Alcock's Rhaenyra Targaryen appears to be reading more of Aegon the Conqueror's documented prophetic dreams, as she states,
From my blood come the prince that was promised.
This is big news for readers of the books. In the second novel, A Clash of Kings, Daenerys ventures into the House of the Undying to seek counsel from the mysterious warlocks of Qarth. Daenerys consumes a psychedelic substance known as Shade of the Evening and experiences multiple prophetic visions. In one, a brutalized woman represents war-torn Westeros. Another features the Wolf King at a feast, foreshadowing the Red Wedding. Several others include snippets from the past and the future of Martin's world. One such moment includes her brother Rhaegar talking with an unknown woman about their newborn son. During this scene, Rhaegar speaks the same words that Rhaenyra speaks in the House of the Dragon trailer. It seems that House of the Dragon will be tackling this crucial plot thread sometime in the future, despite the fact that it apparently has little to do with the main events of the show. With the runaway success of House of the Dragon, the future of the Game of Thrones franchise suddenly looks more optimistic. George R. R. Martin's enthusiasm for the prequel is gradually encouraging fans' trust again after the disastrous final season of Game of Thrones. And the extra efforts taken to adhere to book canon aren't exactly hurting either. HBO seems to be focusing on filling out the world too, with various prequels and spin-offs set in Westeros and Essos lined up. If any of them match the early success of House of the Dragon, then it's likely the streaming titan will go all in on building a potential Martin cinematic universe. If that happens, then revisiting the apocalyptic threat from the far north sounds far too good a spectacle to pass on. Whether it's down to a Jon Snow sequel, another prequel, or simply a plot thread followed by House of the Dragon, there's a good chance that the events of the final season of Game of Thrones will one day feel like nothing more than a bad dream.